The Cubs won the World Series in what seems like ages ago now. There was a bit of sadness in me for my grandmother on my dad's side, his mom, that she had passed away about 6 years ago and that she wasn't able to watch her beloved Cubbies win the World Series. One of my earliest memories as a child is visiting my grandparents in the Lake of the Ozarks area in northern Arkansas and southern Missouri. And I would sit in her very hot kitchen because she didn't believe in air conditioning as she listened on WGN radio to Cubs games. And she was such a hardcore Cubs fan that she was the type of Cubs fan that had never, ever forgiven Harry Carey for calling Cardinals games before. And I wish that she could have been alive to watch the celebration a couple of weeks ago. And I thought the most bizarre thing that ever would come out of my mouth in the year 2016 is the Chicago Cubs won the World Series. I had a similar reaction on Wednesday to the election. Even though my mom and my aunt and my grandmother for sure, and my sisters somewhat, are by no means flag bearers of the blue party in this country. And there's a good chance that my grandmother probably didn't vote for her. I still thought it'd be really cool that my 92-year-old grandmother would see a woman president before she died. She is an incredibly strong woman, hard-nosed and ornery to the core, and I love her. She's a tough old bird, and I love her to death. And I would have loved to seen a woman in the White House for her sake. But alas, that day is still to come. And to quote Seth Meyers' monologue on Late Night this past week, that means that the first female president is somewhere still out there. It means that it could be Nikki Haley, governor of South Carolina. It could be Elizabeth Warren, senator from Massachusetts. It means it could be someone sitting here in this sanctuary right now. God knows I would celebrate like it was 1999. And I've tried to convince her many times if Kathy Stevenson would run. I would celebrate if Mark Stark or Jackie Trishman or Martha Fuller or Bonnie McCarthy or Christina Sanchez-Kerr or Noelle Harlow or any other of the amazing women in this place would run and be the first female president. I would say I would run your campaign, but every campaign I've ever run, I've lost. Maybe the first female president is a member of our Sunday school class. Hopefully we don't have to wait that long. But for my grandmother and my mother and my aunt and my sisters and for my little nieces and for all the fabulous young women and girls that I am blessed to have be part of my life, I wished and I hoped. And I bet some of you did too. But putting personal hopes and desires aside, I want to start this morning with the results about the aftermath, not the election itself. Because the great Reformed theologian Karl Barth says that the Christian preacher is charged with preaching with a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other. Or to update his proclamation, to preach with a Bible in one hand and a Twitter feed and Facebook posts pulled up on our phones. This week has shown that there is still much to do in our country when it comes to encouraging empathy and understanding needed to fuel a more inclusive society. And when the dust settles, how we continue to communicate with one another will be of critical importance. Do we live in fear of our neighbors? Do we live with this disconnect because someone might belong to a different tribe than what we do? Do we blame and shame others? Do we demonize others? Or do we spark dialogue and understanding and appreciation and respect and dignity for each other? I choose the latter. And I imagine that most of you in this place do as well. Because I only know of one path. That is the path of grace and understanding, forgiveness, peace, hope, faith, and love. And the greatest of these is love. It is the way. You know, that was what the church was called in its earliest inception. Before it was called the Christian church, it was called the way. And the way that we need to march and to move and to walk is the way of love. So we will seek here in this place understanding for one another by continuing to provide a platform for people to share their lives from a diverse background, and we will put the kibosh on no one's beliefs and experiences. We will tell them that they are loved by God, as we, all of us are, and through the spirit of building up a divine, beloved community, we will create a safe place that is inclusive of all, so that all may believe, belong, and what? Become. We are going to participate in bringing the fruits of the kingdom of heaven on earth, and those fruits are not just for some, they are for all. But with that being said, some of you know that I used to teach political science at Heidelberg University in Tiffin, Ohio, and we used a textbook in that political science class, and there is a line that I remember from that textbook. It goes like this: in local elections, a person is casting a ballot for or against a neighbor who they might actually encounter in the community, at the grocery store, or at the post office. But the most personal of elections is the presidential election. The nature of the presidential election cycle is such that it makes the electorate feel as if they know the candidates personally, and their decision on who to vote for is often a very intimate affair. For this reason of intimacy, we elate in victory, and we despair in defeat. And often our responses to an outcome is very personalized. And in the days following the results, people's reaction have been personalized and internalized. This is because, let us be frank, the rhetoric on the campaign trail of the president-elect has caused frustration and anger, caused people to lose hope and be fearful of the unknown. This didn't come out of nowhere, this reaction. And I was talking to a friend of mine of this past week, and he is about as centrist as it becomes. He is as independent as it comes. He has voted for both parties. And his Facebook threads were littered with messages about threats of severing long-standing relationships, and worse, shaming and blaming others. You voted against me. You voted against my family. Those are the responses that people have. People are taking the outcome very personally, and there is hurt. But the reaction and the response to that hurt has been either to fuel the anxiety, it's the end of the world as we know it, let's move to Canada, or minimize the pain, it's going to be all right, don't worry, or to be ugly and rude and dismissive. Get over it. Stop. Your side lost. Quit being a sore loser. Or, in the case of Portland, Oregon, to go back to that tried and true way of solving our conflicts with violence. And none of these responses are at best productive, let alone Christ-like. We're not called to ramp up anxiety. We're not called to be dismissive. And we're definitely not called to be rude or to use violence. And because of this, people are starting to lose faith in their fellow Homo sapiens. They're losing their faith in humanity. Now, that's the newspaper part. Let's go over to the biblical part. We encounter Christ today and his disciples nearing the end of Jesus' public ministry. And he is leaving his disciples with some sage words on wisdom of how they ought to live their lives, with some powerful examples of what it means to do ministry in his name. This parable at the end of his public ministry is connected to the great sermon which started his public ministry, the Sermon on the Mount. And there is this amazing echo that has been carried forth through the Gospel of Matthew from the Sermon on the Mount to today's parable. In the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, Jesus identifies the subjects of the kingdom of heaven as the poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek, the hungry, those who thirst for righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, and those who suffer. Apparently, Jesus has the same group of people in mind when he describes the sheep in this parable, those who find intrinsic value and identification with and care for the most vulnerable of our society. You see, the sheep have very little interest, and by being dictated by the terms of social justice and evangelism, which so often turn people into objects and abstractions. The relationships the sheep pursue locate them smack dab in the middle of the least of these, where the king in the parable finds himself. For the goats, the Son of Man is still to come. But for the sheep, the Son of Man is already here, living among the least of these. But to meet the needs of the least of these, one has to be open. Eyes have to be open to see the hungry. Ears have to be open to hear the cries of the sick. Hearts have to be open to realize that prisoners need to be visited. And communities need to be open so that strangers are welcomed as friends. And if we're closed off, if our eyes, our ears, our hearts, our community is closed off due to anger or frustration, fear of the unknown, then we're not going to be able to meet the needs of others. And our needs are not going to be met. We might escalate their pain and anxieties. We might diminish their feelings. We might blame or shame others, or even worse, and God knows the church has been subject to this in its past, we could use violence to shut them up and shut them out. But our stewardship theme this year has been to go and do likewise. We have a mandate to model the life of Christ in our own walk through all of our days. Phillip Gulley, who is the author of the book whose sermon series this sermon is based on, writes, if the church were Christian, we'd remind ourselves constantly that Jesus gave little thought to the importance of the institutional church and was often hostile about institutional religion as a whole. Rather, time and time again, meeting human need took center stage in his life and ministry. To be a follower of Jesus is to choose at every ethical crossroad to serve people over structure. But it's not just the communal and global crossroads that the church must have our eyes and ears and hearts open to. Issues are not just issues. Issues and challenges are about real people. Global hunger and poverty isn't just an issue and an abstraction. There are real people who are hungry, who don't have enough to eat. Access to good, affordable health care isn't just an abstraction and an issue. There are too many men, women, and children who don't have the health care they need here in this country or around the world. Social isolation is not just an issue. There are real people who are hurting, marginalized, pushed out, and made to feel as if they're not important and that they're estranged. And the divisiveness of our country due to political, racial, and religious identifications is not just an issue. Real people, real women, real men, real children are hurting and scared. And when institutions like the church refuses to meet these challenges head on or have the courage to address them, people lose hope. Real people get hurt. Not as an idea or an abstraction, but real people. And there are real and destructive outcomes when people have no hope. Like many churches during the stewardship season, my past church, we often would ask people within the congregation to give a testimony about how their lives had been impacted by the church and why they continued to be involved. One of my favorite and most powerful memories of a testimony given in a church was by a young woman named Amy Kruver. Amy had become a recent member of my church in Kalispell, but she quickly got involved and rose through the ranks to very quickly become moderator. And she was not the typical member of my congregation. She was a young person in a rather mature congregation. She was a person of color. She was a Winnebago Indian in a predominantly white congregation. And even though she was very unchurched, she was thoroughly spiritual. And Amy stood up and said right off the bat at her testimony, I've always believed in God, and I've always had a strong faith in God as a creator and a loving force in my life in the world. But then she went on to explain that due to her life circumstances and her upbringing or her day-to-day job, that things just seem around her on the macro and on the micro level that she had lost faith in humanity. She knew of the terrible effects that substance abuse could have on family members and on a family system. As an Indian in northwest Montana, she experienced racism on a daily basis, both the overt kind, which we all know about the stereotypes, but also a more insidious kind, where white progressive spiritualists would co-opt her Native American culture for their own. And due to the fact that she was a field agent for a U.S. senator, she got daily, angry, violent, nasty phone calls and emails, even having her life threatened on more than one occasion. But because she worked for a senator, she was often asked to come attend community meetings, and she had been invited to attend the Flathead County HIV/AIDS Council, which just so happened to meet in the church that I was serving. And upon walking through the doors of that church, she saw a rainbow flag, and she saw iconography of peace and justice and love around the sanctuary space. And so, against her better judgment, she said, she decided to come and visit the next Sunday. And she had been living through a personal hell, and what she experienced on that first Sunday, she said, quote, confused the hell out of me. Here was a Christian church that was using the Bible as an instrument of love instead of a weapon of violence. Here was a pastor preaching about helping our neighbors through self-sacrifice and forgiveness. Here was a church using mission moments to ask people to donate toothbrushes and hygiene kits for a homeless shelter. And there wasn't a single mention of converting people or saving their souls. In her testimony, Amy said that she came again and again and again and saw that it wasn't just a one-time thing, but this was the message and the ethos and the culture of the church. And even though her people had checkered history, the Native American people of our country have a checkered history with Christianity, she could see herself being involved and being a leader in this church. Amy concluded her testimony with the words that I'll never forget. I see the ugliness of the underbelly of society all the time. Extreme poverty on the reservation, substance abuse for people forgotten by the machine, and other people just being so mean to each other. But through it all, I never lost my faith in God, though I had lost my faith in humanity. But finding a community of faith and belonging to a community of faith like this one helped restore my faith in humanity. And the recurring gift I receive from this church, just about every time I'm about to lose my faith again, it is restored by the people of this place. I echo Amy's testimony. My hope is restored when I come and I'm among you. I hope your hope is restored some when you come into this place. Through the way you responded to the Haitian refugee crisis, the way you participate in the Partnership for Racial Justice, you walk in pride, you work on MLK Day. The Ministry of Mission and Outreach, They proved me wrong. I told them this congregation can't do the Uptown Faith bags and the Thanksgiving meal for the homeless. You have to choose one. They said, no, we're doing both. And you took all the bags and filled up the sign-up sheet for the Thanksgiving meal. Thanks for proving me wrong, people. But generosity begets generosity. Let me say, hope begets hope. So, turning to Phillip Gulley, author of the book If the Church Were Christian, he notes, time and again, I have seen churches revived and persons renewed when they are motivated and inspired to love widely and care deeply for those around them. In the days, the weeks, months, and years ahead, that is what we're going to do, because that is the way to instill hope, keep our faith, and walk in the way of love. Amen and amen.